Uh, okay, thank you. I think, hello everyone. Welcome to the seminar Challenge to Democracy in a Time of Great Changes. My name is Denis Kiryukhin, and I'm research officer of Skovoroda Institute of Philosophy, the National Academy of Science of Ukraine, and I will be one of the two moderators of our meeting today. And first of all, I would like to thank all the speakers for their time and willingness to share their idea on the topic of democracy. Also, I would like to invite all participants to join the seminar and participate in the discussion and ask your questions. Thank you very much for your interest to the seminar. I want to say that the idea of this seminar came while working on the book Community and Tradition Global Times that was published by the Council for Research in Values and Philosophy in this year. And this book was written by a group of scholars mainly from Ukraine, some of whom are with us today. Thanks to the titanic efforts and energy of Hu Yeping, and thanks to the support and hospitality of the Department of Sociology, Igor Sikorsky Kiev Polytechnic Institute, the scientists from many countries such as Ukraine, India, Great Britain, Georgia, Malawi, the United States, and so on, are united today and take part in our seminar. The main theme of this seminar is challenges to democracy. Throughout the history of democracy, there have always been its crises and its critics. For example, 5th century anonymous opinion completer writes, anywhere in the world, the best people are enemies of democracy. And such a discussion between Democrats and anti-democrats has sometimes been very beneficial to democracy itself. But as for me, the current situation is special because there are many books on democracy have been published in a recent year. All of them are united by a reflection on the crisis and a difficult situation with democracy in the world. This such book as How Democracy Dies by Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt, How Democracies End by David Ransman, The People versus Democracy, Why Our Freedom is in Danger and How to Save It by Yasha Monk, Against Democracy, and so on, so on. So we see the big discussion about the problems of democratical development and the crisis and the process of crisis in democratic countries. And so I think that we will have important topics and important questions to discussion today. And Svitlana will tell you more about our work. Svitlana, please.
Thank you. Welcome all to our seminar. I am Svitlana Shcherbak. I'm also a research officer from the Skovoroda Institute of Philosophy of the National Academy of Sciences of Ukraine, and I will moderate the second section of the seminar. And I would like to add some words about our seminar. It focuses around the various threats to democracy in developing and established democracies, and it includes following major topics. First of all, it is a topic of polarization. Polarization is a part of healthy democracy, but intense polarization is one of the key drivers of democratic decay in new and established democracies today. It arises when political opponents begin to regard each other as existential enemies, allowing incumbents to justify abuses of democratic norms, to restrain the opposition, and so on. Intense polarization is closely connected with the rise of populism and nationalism, and the key question is how it can be overcome, how to deal with it. The second major theme is the fate of democracy in developing countries, in particular in post-communist one, and the third is the influence of of economic forces on the survival and viability of democracy. So our aim is to foster conversation between scholars of developing and established democracy. A few words about our program. There are two sections in our seminar with 4 presenters in each section. The first section lasts until 20 a.m. The second starts at 2 p.m. after a 2-hour break. Each speaker has 30 minutes for presentation. At the end of each section, we will have 30 minutes for questions, comments, and discussion. But you can post your questions and comments in the chat during the presentation. Please feel free to comment and ask questions to our speakers. By the way, today is the birthday of one of our presenters, namely Andrew. Is he already here or not yet? Okay, then
I'm here. Hello.
Here. Okay. So the whole team wishes you a happy birthday and a great year. May this day will be the happiest and the most productive of your birthday. Well, and now I would like to ask Pavlo, the chair of our seminar and the sociology department of the National Technical University of Ukraine, to say a few words to welcome all us. Please, Pavlo.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure and honor. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Great pleasure and honor to be with all of you, and could not have agreed more what my distinguished colleagues have already said, that from its very beginning, democracy has always been a crisis. But we live in a really interesting time, as a great British historian Eric Hobsbawm titled his memoir. And the time we are living through are particularly interesting because, on the one hand, democracy has become a universal mode of legitimation of every regime, of every nation state, of every political state. It's extremely hard to, with minor exceptions, to come across a political system which would not claim that it's democratic in nature. At the same time, we've been participating in these endless talks about the crisis of democracy. So there is this kind of disbalance, contradiction between universalizing, legitimizing power of democracy on the one hand, and reflection about democracy. And I think this discussion about the crisis of democracy has been influenced by our realization that democracy has had a great promise, and that promise has not always been delivered, especially in countries of the post-Soviet era, where there was a great hope at the beginning of this transformation, at the beginning of Gorbachev's perestroika, but after more than 3 decades, we cannot say that democratic institutions have been embedded everywhere, and democratic practices are efficient. And even the very idea of democracy is commanding an unquestionable support from local populations. So there are a lot of issues to be discussed, and I'm really looking forward to today's discussion. And again, thank you for joining this seminar. And I'm pretty positive that we are going to have a great discussion today. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Pavel. And I think we can start because I see we have all of our presenters in for first session. So we start our work, and our first presenter is Professor Anatol Lieven, Edmund Walsh School of Foreign Service, Georgetown University, Qatar, Doha. And the title of his presentation is Why Democracies Fail, the Contingent Nature of Political System. Professor Lieven, please, we are waiting for your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay? Can everyone hear me?
Absolutely, right.
Oh, good, good. By the way, I should say I'm about to join the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft in Washington. So that will be my new position as a senior fellow there. So I thought I'd begin by talking a bit about the history of thinking about democracy over the past generation since the end of the Cold War. Because it seems to me that although Francis Fukuyama's End of History has been pretty thoroughly debunked and criticized in the almost 30 years since it was written, for a long time at least, a sort of softer, semi-conscious version of Fukuyama's thesis did in fact become hegemonic in thinking about democracy and democratization in the West and in all places influenced by the West. And what this essentially set out was a teleology. A teleology not merely which assumed that the whole world was moving towards liberal democracy, but that there was only one form of liberal democracy, and there was basically only one way to get there. And that this, of course, was tied up as well automatically with successful capitalism. And this was reflected in endless phrases, some of which I laughed at in previous books. You know, the whole pseudoscience or academic discipline of transitionology, the whole thing implying that there was a transition, you know, a clear transition, a set out transition from something else to democracy. And so you had phrases like, you know, the path to democracy and the free market, the path, only one. You had phrases like getting to Denmark, Denmark being a kind of paradise or nirvana. And everyone was not merely supposed to get to Denmark, but could in fact get to Denmark. You had journals like The Economist writing that Kyrgyzstan, say, you know, only had to adopt a single standard universal set of rules for change and reform, and Kyrgyzstan would be like Estonia. Well, you know, any of us who've lived in the former Soviet Union knows that that was never likely to happen. So there was this teleological approach, and this really became embedded also in state-backed institutions in the West, the National Endowment for Democracy, Freedom House, and so forth, really based on this transition, this teleology, this idea of the one path. And at a more popular or vulgar level, it was reflected in talk, you know, throughout the newspapers about normal countries being countries like the West. I always remember an amusing conversation I had with a colleague on the Times when I was a journalist who, in a moment of exasperation, sometime in the 1990s, asked, when will Russia become a normal country? And I asked him, what exactly do you mean, like a normal country? And lo and behold, he said, well, a normal country like Denmark. And I said, I don't think any time very soon. But he also said, interestingly enough, well, a normal country like the United States. Well, as we know, the United States is diverging now very, very strongly in many ways from what one thinks, you know, or as Denmark, this Danish model. But of course, the other thing that was profoundly foolish about this, and this is the subject of our meeting today, is that it assumed that Denmark would always remain Denmark, that Denmark itself could not change, that this was a paradise. Of course, the interesting thing is that this is very like the Marxist vision, of course, which goes totally against Marx's whole vision of history, which is why Marx is really a kind of religious thinker rather than a scientist, God help us. but the idea that, you know, once communism has been achieved, you move towards a perfect communist society, which then doesn't change. Now, by the way, the most absurd thing about this from a Marxist point of view is, of course, Marx's whole scheme of history is based on the idea that social and political change is driven ultimately by technological change. Changes in technology bring about changes in the means of production, bring about changes in society and the superstructure of politics. But somehow Marx assumed that after the achievement of socialism, either there would be no more technological change, which is ridiculous given human history and instincts, or that somehow Marx's whole vision of how history works would become nullified or uncoupled, and technological changes would have no impact on society. Well, as we have seen over the past couple of generations, technological changes generated by, above all, Western capitalism, but then adopted by other people, are having transformative effects on our economies, obviously, but therefore on our societies, on our social systems, and therefore on our democracies. So Denmark is not remaining Denmark. Other thing, of course, is demographic change. Denmark itself, when it comes to the management of immigration and the integration of immigrants, has brought in recent years, measures which certainly 40 years ago would have been considered inconceivable and highly illiberal. In other ways, of course, Denmark does remain a sort of democratic paradise, but it is facing a challenge which requires what would in the past at least have been called an undemocratic response. Now, of course, what this brings in is the tension between democracy and liberal democracy. And liberal democracy is in itself, in part, historically speaking, an oxymoron, because, as I'm sure all of you know, in the 19th century, liberals were not Democrats. Wherever liberals ruled, they restricted the franchise. They were extremely suspicious of the masses, especially in Catholic Europe, because, of course, the Catholic peasantry was viewed as retrograde, superstitious, monarchical, against economic reform. And of course, as we have seen, at first I saw this, well, first one saw it, of course, historically speaking, Spain, Italy, South America, liberal reformists being anti-democrats against the people. But one also saw it, of course, after the end of the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc. You saw liberal reformers in Russia, in Ukraine, in Eastern Europe, who explicitly despised the mass of the population. In Russia, I'm not sure about Ukraine, the phrase was homo sovieticus, who was regarded as a sort of subhuman, so mired in slavery and communism and authoritarianism that he or she could not adapt themselves to the new wonderful free market. And basically, it would be better if they died off, as I must say, I heard some Russian liberal reformers say quite explicitly, and their Western backers too. So the tension between liberal reform and democracy. And now, of course, one sees this in the West as well. After a few votes, which liberal internationalists found extremely uncomfortable, Brexit in Britain, of course, the rise of right-wing populist parties in Western Europe, in America, the election of Trump, you had more and more talk among liberals of how maybe democracy was not such a good thing. Oh, I mean, the rule of law, yes, liberal values, yes, but maybe it was not such a good idea to give the masses a vote after all, if they're going to use it to vote against all the things that liberals believe in. And one of the main problems for democracy in recent times has been the tension in a good many places between liberal democracy and nationalism. With socialism, if not dead, at least in abeyance, with religion very much in abeyance, democracy and nationalism are the two great legitimizing forces of states in the world today, ideological legitimizing forces. When they work together, well, it's fine for the legitimacy of the state, maybe not for liberal rights or values, but of course they can run into each other. I think from that point of view, it's worth noting that in the 19th century, one of the tremendous strengths of liberalism, at least until they lost it to the conservatives, was the association of liberalism and nationalism. You would not have had the success of liberalism, or the semi-success, over large parts of Europe, like in Italy, in the 19th century, if it had not been backed up by nationalism, the idea of strengthening the nation through economic and social reform. That extended as far as Japan, the Middle East, and so on. Now, over recent decades, liberalism and nationalism have moved apart. And in part as a result of this, and in part as a result, of course, of the economic and social changes that we've seen in recent decades, we have a situation in which liberal democracy is threatened by mass democracy in some places. Hungary, obviously a very good example. Poland, a very good example. Large parts of America, a very good example. The Philippines, a very good example. And above all, the really, really big one, India. Because the highly authoritarian, highly illiberal, highly nationalist, in some cases, most cases, governments of these countries have all been democratically elected. Even Putin, although this is obscured by the fact that, of course, he also does rig elections, certainly the ones that I witnessed, he won a majority, probably still would today, although of course we can't be sure of that. In other words, you have a situation in which electoral democracy is working against liberal democracy. So the point is that the things that transitionology, getting to Denmark, assumed were one and the same, liberal values, the rule of law, and elections by an electorate with one man, one vote, sorry, one man and woman now, one vote, are not, it turns out, necessarily the same thing. But I have to say, having once been a classical scholar, I have no idea why anyone was surprised by this. Remember what happened to Socrates. And this is what, of course, essentially turned Plato, well, it probably was already, into a sort of, well, difficult to say what Plato was by contemporary standards, but he certainly wasn't a democrat. The point being, of course, that Socrates was executed by the democratic will of the Athenian people, majority vote. Remember, that was direct democracy of the assembly of all the citizen males of Athens. Athens was not a liberal democracy. So on the one side, you have this threatened by populist nationalism. But of course, populist nationalism is in turn is strengthened by the thing lurking within so many democracies, which is oligarchy. The way in which indirect democracies, obviously not direct democracies like Athens, but elective democracies, can be essentially taken over from within, or simply retain, as in the case of America, strong elements of oligarchy, where oligarchical elites basically create a mask of democracy or operate behind a mask of democracy to maintain their own power and domination of the system. Of course, against this you then get populist uprisings, which is what we've seen in so many places. Revolts of the masses against the domination of the elites. If you look at America today, I can't remember who said this. I'd like to think it was me, but I fear somebody said it before. You know that the phrase, the great phrase, also can't remember who said it, about the American system and constitution is, it is a government not of men, but of laws. And somebody quipped that in recent decades, the government of America has become a government not of men, but of lawyers. 3/5 of the members of the US Congress are lawyers. And if you look at the laws that come out of the US Congress, you can see how they are skewed in favor of the legal class, which extracts rent from the system because of the way in which it organizes the system. And of course, then there is simply in the United States also the role of wealth in taking over the system. And as a result, we see democracy in the West, not Africa and Asia and former Soviet Union, now under considerable threat, liberal democracy. Now, I think the central point is that a kind of sacred air has come to surround democracy in the thinking of most of the intelligentsia of the West and offshoots of the West. And of course, there are good reasons for this. Churchill's famous remark about democracy, the worst system in the world except for all the others. But that is in principle. In other words, in an ideal world, in a closed laboratory, democracy, liberal democracy, is indeed a much better system. All other things being equal, rebus sextantibus, we would all wish to live in a liberal democracy. But in the real world, democracy is, of course, a political system. And the point about political systems is that they face in their lives, of course, which go on for many centuries, a series of different challenges. Often, of course, they are created in the first place to meet a particular set of challenges. And ultimately, their survival will depend on their ability to meet these challenges. And sometimes a system which has been fantastically good at meeting one set of challenges turns out to be hopelessly bad at meeting another, for which it's not configured. I fear, as somebody who's written about climate change, that we may find that capitalist democracy, so superbly good at creating economic systems which, at least for a century or so, work to raise the living standards of the mass of the population, may prove hopeless when it comes to meeting the challenge of climate change, a completely new challenge for which democracy was not designed. And then, of course, there is social and economic change. The monarchical system in France, which had worked pretty damn well for several centuries, could not operate successfully on the basis of a radically changed French society by the end of the 18th century. Nor, of course, could the Russian system, nor indeed could the Soviet system. The society under your feet changes, your political system has to change or collapse as a result. Now, in meeting these challenges, the greatest resource of any political system is legitimacy. What is legitimacy? Legitimacy is basically, well, Max Weber set out 5 different kinds of legitimacy. But legitimacy is basically the ability of a state to get people to accept its laws, to obey its laws, to obey its orders, without having to shoot them, or threaten to shoot them, or torture them, or arrest them. Automatic obedience to the state. Weber talked about religious legitimacy, traditional legitimacy. Democracy, in a way, is a kind of traditional legitimacy, as it's built up either within countries or in countries which are the models, like the United States and Western Europe for other countries. Personal charisma. And certainly democracy, the idea of a state based on the will of the people, is a tremendous source of legitimacy in the world today. But then again, so is nationalism. The idea of a state based on the will of the people, not just today, as reflected in votes, but permanently in history. In other words, that the state reflects the nation as it has existed for centuries and as it will continue to exist in future. One should not underestimate the tremendous power of that as a source of legitimacy. But finally, there is performance legitimacy. It's simply how well the state does in meeting particular challenges, in performing vital tasks. What are the vital tasks? The vital tasks are, in the end, whatever the population thinks are vital tasks. Some of them have been permanent throughout the whole of history. They are defense against external enemies, the maintenance of internal security, and the prevention of famine, as far as you can. Others come and go. Well, some of them are very particular. The legitimacy of the Aztec state, of course, depended on making the sun come up in the morning, which required legitimacy required the provision of plentiful numbers of human sacrifices each day to make sure that happened. The legitimacy of the Aztec state depended on that. I'm not suggesting that as a universal model. Interestingly, for some states in the world, the control of water, the management of water, has always been critical. China, for example. The mandate of heaven has always depended to a considerable extent there on the management of water. Same thing in Holland. But of course, in most of the West, that's not been an issue. We've had enough water and in the right places. But the legitimacy of Western states too, in future, Western democracies, will depend very heavily on the management of water. Now, one of the ways of looking at other kinds of legitimacy, ideological legitimacy, are that they buy time. In other words, a legitimate state, from democracy, from religion, from nationalism, will have more time to cope with challenges which will crumple up less legitimate states. In the early 1930s, Britain, America, with highly legitimate democratic systems, survived the terrible economic impact of the Great Depression. Weimar Germany and a row of countries in Eastern Europe with much more shallow, much weaker democratic traditions and traditions of democratic legitimacy collapsed under the impact. But I think we have to recognize that democracy or other forms of legitimacy buy time, but they do not buy indefinite amounts of time. If any system goes on and on failing at meeting these key challenges, it will ultimately collapse. Now, in America today, to a lesser extent in Europe, but to a considerable extent in democratic parts of the former communist bloc, a key problem of our political systems today, not as a result of lack of legitimacy, but contributing to lack of legitimacy, is the failure to do something which has been fundamental to states, to every state, since the very beginnings of states, I don't know, 5,000, 6,000 years ago, and that is to raise revenue, to raise taxes. Because without taxes, the state can't do anything. It cannot defend the country, it cannot maintain the dikes, can't build the flood defenses, it can't clean the irrigation channels, it can't conscript people or pay people to rebuild the infrastructure. And of course, what one has seen in political systems, as far back as one can see, China is a particularly good example because it does have this more or less continuous history, but it was a problem in South Asia throughout history as well, is the resistance of powerful parts of the population. Traditionally, this wasn't just wealthy landowners and chieftains or merchants, but actually armed local communities as well. People don't like paying taxes. And of course, what we have seen in recent decades is, as a result of the globalization of the world economy and the ascendancy of new kinds of economic elites in the West, and then a variety of other things, particularly in America, that I won't go into, is the way in which elites have been able to use democracy or manipulate democracy to basically evade taxes and undermine the resource base of the state. The state simply doesn't have the money to do the vital things it needs to do. And of course, we see this in an acute form. Well, you saw it in the acute form in the former Soviet Union in the 1990s, where the elite simply looted the states and moved the money to offshore accounts. But one sees it to a very considerable extent in the West as well. And it's not just that they take the money and evade taxes, but of course they also threaten every state. If you bring in higher taxes, if you do things we don't like, we will move our money somewhere else and there's nothing you can do about it. And of course, in the United States, you see a situation in which the wealthy basically pay their representatives in Congress to pass taxes, to pass laws exempting the rich from more and more and more taxes. This has been the permanent nightmare of the Chinese state, and fear of it lies very heavily behind a lot of what Xi Jinping is doing today. Throughout history, local elites have tried to emancipate themselves from the power of the central Chinese state. And through a sort of what appears to be a law of political entropy, as dynasties grow older, they more and more lose control of the local elites, who simply won't pay taxes, and the state loses the ability to make them pay taxes. As a result, the state can't pay its armies, it can't feed its conscript laborers to maintain the dikes, you have enormous floods, you have barbarian invasions, the dynasty collapses. We have a situation, I think, today in which democracy is threatened from within by what are, in certain respects, some very traditional dangers. And of course, there are real attempts to push back against this, like President Biden's attempt to rebuild American infrastructure, to create masses of new jobs, to overcome the huge growing inequality which has affected America. It is not easy to see how a country can be fully democratic, can be regarded as truly democratic, in which a senior manager in a company earns more than 600 times the wage of one of his or her workers, in which Jeff Bezos can earn in one day, or I think it was even in 1 hour, the wages of his entire workforce for 1 year. That's not a situation which is tenable in the long run. And it should be noted, by the way, that Athenian democracy was founded initially, very largely, on a reform which abolished debt, a jubilee, if you like. The Athenian peasantry, working classes, had become increasingly indebted, hopelessly indebted. A semi-authoritarian reformer came in, cleared all the debts. Not likely to happen in America anytime soon, but the way things are going, you will get more and more demands for something like that in the West. Couple of last points. One is we should be aware in a historical context of the contingent nature of Western liberal democracy. America is, everything in history is accidental, but my point is, if America had not been there, liberal democracy would not have survived the Second World War. The liberal democracies of Western Europe were defeated. Britain only held out because it was surrounded by the sea, and of course some very brave airmen. Without America, either Hitler would have won or Stalin would have won. What happened after that, we don't know. And of course, America itself only survived because it won the Civil War in the 1860s, which the South could have won if a few states had gone the other way, a few battles had gone the other way. Of course, if you had an independent Confederate States of America alongside the Union, there would have been no liberal democratic hegemony in the 20th century. We are historically contingent. We need to keep that in mind. Now, the final question a very unpopular one in liberal circles in the West, is how much diversity a democratic system can stand. John Stuart Mill famously, or if you will, infamously by contemporary standards, said that a certain basic homogeneity was essential as a support for liberal democracy. Tocqueville said much the same. Is this true? Certainly we see evidence that a rapid change in the demographic composition of a society can lead to a very serious illiberal backlash. This produced Trump, after all, contributed greatly to Brexit. It hasn't yet brought down, well, and the fear of it has contributed greatly to the illiberal democracies of Poland and Hungary. Hasn't yet actually destroyed a democracy, and we don't know how it will go in future. Some countries seem to be coping reasonably well, others much less so. Or, of course, you have a situation in which, for ancient reasons, you have a population deeply divided, either ethnically or culturally, religiously, all three. And the different bits are, in the end, unwilling to live in one state together. And that brings me to the final point, I think, really illustrated by the United States today, which is called polarization, but that, I think, to some extent underestimates the extent of the problem. I've lived now for 7 years in the Middle East. Before that, I lived in South Asia. And one thing I think that really strikes you about the Middle East and democracy is that democracy, democratic legitimacy, is an excellent system when it comes to, in sort of semi-Rousseauist terms, achieving the legitimacy of laws, of measures on secondary issues. Procedural justice. You may not like the law, but you accept the legitimacy of the process that produced it, of the system that produced it. But if you have a situation as in Egypt, or Iran, or Turkey, or basically most of the Middle East, in which huge sections of the population disagree fundamentally about the basic character of the state, about the basic identity of the state in religious, cultural, ethnic, racial terms, then it is very difficult to see how that can be resolved by democracy, or perhaps managed even by democracy. One may have, at best, a system like Iran or increasingly Turkey, in which there is limited room for elections, but the frame of the state is unchangeable and dictated from above and cannot be changed by elections. And the elections are managed to make sure that that does not happen. Well, my fear is that we now see a situation like that in America, that the views of conservatives and liberals about the very nature of the American state are so different that they simply cannot work together to make democracy work. And therefore, every necessary reform falls victim to this basic clash. And of course, as a result, increasingly you also see both sides denying the legitimacy of the electoral result, because they cannot bear the idea that their enemies have been legitimately elected by the political system. So the Democrats tried to present Trump as basically having been created by Vladimir Putin, and the Republicans, of course, are now alleging that the last elections in America were rigged. I think it would be a mistake to underestimate just how much trouble the United States is in today from that point of view. And of course, if American democracy really falters, then the chances of liberal democracy elsewhere in the world will be pretty poor. Anyway, sorry for that rather gloomy introduction, but I hope that has kicked off the discussion for the rest of the day. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Lieven, for your very interesting, very important presentation. We will discuss it at the end of our part, because we have some questions for you in our chat. But now our next presenter is Professor Pavlo Kutuyev, and the title of his presentation is Democracy and the State Capacity, How to Build Development State in a Democratic Environment. Please, Professor Pavlo, start.
Thank you. Thank you. Again, it's a great honor and a great pleasure to be with all of you. And I'm really grateful to Anatol, because actually he has already addressed and to a great extent answered the issues I was going to talk about. So at this point, I may have ended my conversation, but since I'm given time, I will take this unique opportunity, and again, thanks to Anatol, will draw upon his insights. But unlike him, my talk is rather a set of questions and attempt kind of to identify issues, challenges, and kind of enlist support of great thinkers, both from the past and our contemporaries, to address these issues. And I will stop short of offering kind of answers to my own questions. And I'm soliciting kind of your insights, your participation, and your input kind of to address these issues. And I will be, again, I will be mentioning Anatol's speech quite a few times, because it's been extremely interesting and penetrating analysis of the global, of the state of democracy as a global affair. But also, I think it was Vladimir Lenin who put in his seminal book on the state and revolution, that the liberal democracy is the best political shell for the capitalism. Kind of putting aside all ideological clashes, I think we should take this claim seriously, because we've got kind of a set of superimposing issues in the contemporary world, and not just with democracy. And democracy and crisis of democracy we are talking about today, and not just today, is rather a reflection of a crisis of modern world system, as American historical sociologist of world systemic bent Immanuel Wallerstein like to put it. So we've got different layers of this world system. The system is highly hierarchical and unequal in economic terms. And Wallerstein has always pointed out that this system, since its very beginning in the early modern world, in late 15th, early 16th century, during this so-called long 15th century, it began in mid 15th century and lasted till mid 17th century. So this system has been incredibly stable, and there have been very few newcomers managing to get to the top. In fact, if we take into account relatively big countries, only Germany and Japan, again, managed to get to the top, and they paid a horrible price for their success, a horrible price in all terms. So this system, its kind of tiers are the core, semi-periphery, and periphery at the bottom. And societies are highly unequal in social and economic terms. And I think it gives us a very interesting and useful kind of analytical tool, because with all these challenges to democracy and liberalism in so-called developed world, in nations belonging to the core of the world system, we still cannot compare the state of democracy in the core to the state of democracy in the periphery. And if you run even kind of very simplistic statistical analysis, we will immediately, we will be forced to jump to conclusion that more or less stable democracy are located in core nations, unstable democracies and authoritarian dictatorships and autocracies are mostly located in periphery, and semi-periphery is some sort of battleground between forces of democracy, liberalism on the one hand, and authoritarianism and autocracy on the other hand. So economic development, the access of economic resources, and social justice are key issues and perhaps kind of key prerequisites for relatively successful economic development. I really like Anatol's idea that not every country is supposed to become Denmark, and Denmark itself is changing, is undergoing transformation. So when I first began studying sociology of development and modernization, I was struck by its set of categories, that developed countries versus developing countries. And I was thinking at the beginning, how come being capable of developing is better than achieving a certain stage of development and then ceasing to develop? So these categories are quite misleading, because developed nations continue to be developing, and they are on this developmental track, unlike nations we habitually call developing, because more often than not, these so-called developing nations are not developing. They are experiencing what great left-wing and critical scholar Andre Gunder Frank termed as development of underdevelopment. So we have to bear in mind this great inequality in the world between core nations, nations of the core, which are developed on the one hand and continue developing, and the rest of the world, which is underdeveloped and continue being underdeveloped, kind of racing to the bottom, again, as sociologists of development and underdevelopment like to say. And one more point Anatol has made, and it's congruent with my own thinking. It's that, again, Denmark, which is changing, and whether or not Denmark should be a model for other nations to be adopted. I myself has always been critical of this kind of linear, unitary monocropping, institutional monocropping. This term has been coined by American sociologist, developmental sociologist Peter Evans. But when we are criticizing monocropping, we are facing a danger of falling into the trap of nativism and nationalism, because authoritarian leaders, autocrats, are really fond on revoking the uniqueness of their nations, rejecting these universal models which don't fit into their unique culture, unique traditions, unique institutional framework. And therefore, again, this is the question which I myself
yeah, I'm sorry, but Professor Kumar, please switch off your microphone.
Okay, I'll mute everybody. Okay, now it's better. Thanks. So this is the question I'm posing to everybody. And again, would be extremely grateful to your input because I myself don't have an answer. How do you combine your tradition, your culture, your heritage, your legacy, your uniqueness with democratic and liberal principles and human rights principles, which are universal in their nature? Again, how do you achieve the balance, again, between kind of protecting your sovereignty, your economic independence, your right to unique institutions, but democratic and liberal institutions, with kind of coping with the task of joining organizations like the European Union or NATO, which have a demand that you simply adopt their legal and institutional framework. And unless you succeed in doing so, there is no discussion about you joining, about you being let in. So again, to me, it's a kind of critical issue because quite a few autocratic leaders or autocracy, authoritarianism leaning leaders in post-Soviet countries have been employing this rhetoric of nativism and thus rejecting Western institutions as institutions developed in the West, and this kind of infamous practice of what about them is often being employed here, like history of slavery in America or genocide of native population or history of Western imperialism and colonialism. These facts from the past and the present are used as are used to legitimize autocracy and authoritarianism now and here, again, in quite few post-Soviet nations. And this brings us kind of to the major challenge I would like to talk about today. It's kind of the relationship between democracy and economic development, and how we achieve economic development, how we push economic developmental agenda in the countries which are on a track to economic and societal, in broader terms, underdevelopment. And it's kind of great that we have such a distinguished panel of scholars representing different countries, different regions. So I'm really looking forward to their comments and their corrections of my statements, because for a long time I've been interested in East Asian social, political, and most of all economic modernization. And I've been interested in a phenomenon which political and historical sociologists call or define as developmental state. It's a state which is capable of unleashing rapid economic development. And to name but a few examples, and the prior example is Japan, of course, but then it was joined by the so-called Asian tigers like South Korea and Taiwan. And their economic achievements had been extremely impressive and had been great. But we have to keep in mind that the political shell of these economic systems was authoritarianism, and it was militant authoritarianism in Japan, in interwar Japan, and obviously World War II Japan. And then South Korea, well, Taiwan was a single-party dictatorship for significant length of its post-war history. And South Korean road to economic development, industrialization, road to becoming an industrial giant and economic superpower began with an introduction of a military dictatorship of Pak Chon-hee. So Ukraine is in a different part of the world. Ukraine is kind of squeezed between authoritarian Russia and relatively liberal democratic European Union. So, as example of Belarus shows that it's unlikely that Ukraine can risk sliding into a pure form of authoritarianism, again, because of the proximity of the European Union and some leverage of European institutions in Ukraine. But at the same time, the question arises, if you have, chaotic democracy, or what our American colleagues Luke Conway and Stephen Levitsky define as a competitive authoritarianism. So Ukrainian political pluralism is there not because of enhanced embeddedness of democratic institutions and practices, but because of thanks to different competing interests, powerful vested selfish interests of Ukrainian oligarchs. And none of these competing factions, can manage to get an upper hand, eliminate its opponents, and install autocratic authoritarian regime. So these are deficiencies of strive to authoritarian regime that produce this political pluralism and these vibes towards democracy in Ukraine rather than democracy itself. So how do you introduce a developmental agenda while having a rather weak and dysfunctional state? And again, this is, I think, it's a very critical question, because in the United States there is this very influential talk and even ideology of a suspicion towards big government. And these liberal intellectuals were quick to notice that, and they were liberal intellectuals in post-Soviet countries and in Ukraine as well. It's no exception in this respect. So these liberal intellectuals have been quick to employ this discourse of big government as an embodiment of a tyranny, and therefore we should be suspicious towards big government, especially given that majority of past history was not that democratic, was not that extremely democratic. So therefore, we have to be very suspicious towards government, towards capacity. And I am from government. I'm here to help. The most terrifying words in English, as Ronald Reagan liked to quip. And therefore, quite a few intellectuals and politicians keep promoting the same ideas, that the state should be limited, that markets should reign. But again, how can markets reign if institutional infrastructure of market economy is underdeveloped? And it cannot be developed by definition, given that just several decades ago, Ukraine was a part of bigger country, bigger empire, which had a totally state-run economy. So therefore, you need some institution, and I think these institutions are located within the political subsystem of a broader social system, namely state institutions, which would be capable to launch this economic development, to rebuild from the scratch some sort of welfare regimes, to strive for social justice while preserving democracy, or while trying to achieve democracy, trying to embed democracy. And the kind of every challenge I've just listed is unique and profound in itself. Because again, like North Korea was focused on economic development under local generals' rule and did not care about democracy that much. And the transition to democracy there begins in the 80s. And now it's extremely vibrant democracy, perhaps one of the most dynamic and vibrant democracies in the world, because I think this is the only kind of economically developed democracy which tries and indicts and sends to jail its own presidents. The daughter of Park Chung-hee, whom I mentioned several times, was impeached, removed from the office, and tried, convicted, and sent to jail. And she is serving. She is doing her time now, and I think she was given something around 20 years in prison. Again, I'm not advocating removing every head in state and putting him or her into jail, but it's a very telling example of the dynamism of South Korean democracy. So we've got an equation. So how to launch economic development, ensure social stability and social justice and some sort of social welfare, to strive for social equality, because my colleagues and I recently produced a chapter for a book on 3 decades of Ukrainian history, independent history, and the book project was introduced under Professor Mikhail Minakov's leadership and just came out, was just published. And we were focusing on the great deal of inequality we are living through in contemporary Ukraine. So kind of my recipe would be kind of to restore the state autonomy and state capacity, state capability, while maintaining kind of democratic practices and democratic regimes. So the state should be autonomous, should be capable of devising and implementing policy, but at the same time, it should be capable of communicating with the society, with the political society, with the civil society, and it should be capable of bearing in mind the challenges of social and economic inequality. These are mammoth tasks, and again, I've seen my duty today to enlist these tasks and challenges and solicit your support in addressing them. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Professor Kutuyev, for your presentation, for start a little discussion between our presenters, and it's very important, it's very interesting, and I think we will discuss more widely these questions in the end. And now I want to make presentation Professor Sanjeev Kumar. Is Professor Kumar with us? Yes, I see you, and nice to see you. And the title of presentation of Professor Kumar is "The Shrinking Democratic Space in the Age of Authoritarian Populism, the Islamophobic Discourse of Hindi Nationalism, and the Making of Illiberal Public Culture in India." Very interesting topic, and please, Professor.
Okay, am I audible? Am I audible?
Yeah.
Okay, so the timing which shows is 10:30 to 11:10. So will it be split into a Q&A session? or how is it? How are we doing? Or should I speak for 30 or 40 minutes?
Okay, but maybe we will make some changes to our program, and our next presenter will be Professor Andrew Yeo, and you will be fourth presenter, maybe.
Okay.
You can speak 30 to 35 minutes.
20 to 25 minutes. Okay.
Okay.
30.
30. 25.
Okay.
Thanks. Yeah. Thanks for the confirmation, and I'd like to thank WHO and the colleagues and RVP Council for having me here. And it has been a very significant, we are at the cusp of a situation where we need to discuss what are the challenges to democracy itself. It's not just because we are living in a very torrid time, but this COVID-19 has actually accentuated our doubts and apprehensions regarding the functioning of democracy. Now, what I'll do is for about 10-15 minutes, I'll theoretically establish what I would like to speak. Well, I'll draw from the new Aristotelian ideals, where how, like a city-state contemplated the whole notion of, political communication, and then bring in Hobbesian Thomas Hobbes, the notion of civil science, and now critique that, or sorry, contrast it in terms of what Carl Schmitt actually does in terms of looking at this whole idea of in his Friend and Enemy, and also exceptionalism, what he calls as exceptionalism, the whole idea of exceptionalism, and how it actually applies to present day India. So in that sense, then what I'll do is, what has happened to India, we are looking at a lost public culture, which in a way, why I call lost, the almost hundreds of years old public culture, which was built in terms of the values of cosmopolitanism, eclecticism, the way in which that has been in a way we can't even call deconstructed, but rather actually bulldozed, and a new public culture or a public narrative is being fed upon us in the name of nationalism, and how that actually sinks in with the whole idea of sovereign exceptionalism of Carl Schmitt. So primarily the way in which this whole talk of mine would be a critique of the present day public culture which is being developed in India, for which I'll be using Carl Schmitt. So now, any democracy always thrives in terms of what Habermas actually calls in terms of, there should be it's a communicative action, public sphere. Just 1 second, let me put off my software, otherwise it keeps on disturbing. Allow me 1 minute.
Windows D desktop folder view J JAWS 17 point up cursor with JAWS 7 enter JAWS context X leaving menus quit JAWS dialog enter.
Okay, now I hope that it doesn't disturb us. Okay, so as I said, any public sphere which is a quintessential for a democracy that actually needs what we call as communicative action, where interaction is very, very important. Like people have to speak. There has to be space where you need to have the liberty to call a spade as a spade. Now, why this is so crucial to democracy is because the governments often leave apart any particular kind of a party, or it's a fascist or a leftist or Maoist, whatever party it may be. They try to divide people for the benefits of their own executive purposes. Now, this I would like to indicate the way in which India has often been like contested, like there is a contested public sphere in terms of secularism versus communalism. This has been a very contested debate, And that has been often exploited, not just now, but there has been political parties which have instrumentalized that. And all have been done in the name of nationalism, or what we call as secular nationalism. But what is the change that is happening for last 6 to 8 years is this whole idea of secular nationalism has been, like completely, sabotaged, and a variant of cultural nationalism is being pushed, where a monolithic notion of culture is being advocated as nationalism, which has to be accepted without any debate. You can, in a way, talk about it critically at the risk of being, hounded, and like in, social media, there are trolls. You will be trolled, and if you just cross the red line between liberty of speech and sedition is becoming very, very thin. So, in a way, this whole idea of Habermasian communicative action is completely subdued because of the punitive power of the state. Like the Weberian state has the monopoly over violence, and I'll bring in Carl Schmitt in a moment, where exceptionalism of sovereignty, when the executive actually invokes it, it has all the rights to state that whatever we do, that is in the interest of the state, and the executive takes charge of the situation. Now, parliamentary democracy is completely, pushed into the oblivion. And that is where Habermasian communicative action actually gets questioned. Now, that doesn't mean that we are not having a parliamentary democracy, but what we call as the discourse ethics, which should govern the nature of parliamentary democracy, where we have a competent opposition. Now, the irony which India is facing is whatever the opposition says, that is always, it is not just the government. Government would say that, opposition is doing oppositional politics. But the common masses, my biggest worry is the way in which social media has become a battleground where people are actually contesting anybody who is talking against the government. There is a majority. And this is what new India is somewhat different from the older India. Now you can say that there is a huge machinery, kind of a machinery to actually, support this, which was not there even with Hitler. Say, for example, imagine Hitler having WhatsApp, Twitter, and the way in which he could have communicated, or anybody like Stalin. And there is a problem with the role of media also. So that these empirical things, I'll just give a cursory look, but my broader point is the more philosophical and theoretical notion as to how the communicative action has been scuffled, whether the media, talking softly about the government, which media was always to be fourth pillar of democracy, which the Indian media is not performing the function. Are the people really getting the proper interpretation of the news? It is not about good news or bad news, or false news or true news. That is not the problem in India. No media actually foments false news. But what is happening is the way in which it is interpreted. Say, for example, it is just serving a dessert with a pinch of salt or more sugar. So if you serve a dessert with a pinch of salt, that will be a different thing. It will not change its ontology of being a dessert, but its taste would change. But if you add more sugar to it, the candy or the dessert may become more tasty also. Now, truths have to be always served with a pinch of salt, a simple philosophy. Because if you serve it as tasty, then people would never understand. Now that do we think that, like people lack the analytical skill? That is another ontological question which we need to have. Now, there is no problem with the literacy rate in this country, but being literate and being educated is a different thing altogether. And when I say literate, you can even be a graduate and a postgraduate and have dogmatic feelings in your mind. Like every society has its own dogmas, India has its own dogmas. Say, for example, the chief minister of a province commenting on a torn jeans which was worn by a lady. Now, this is where the literate and the literate uneducated comes into picture. Now, how this has happened? Because as Karl Popper says, if you don't want to falsify something, then it becomes a dogma. So falsification is a very basic philosophy of science, where the philosophy of epistemology, the whole notion of epistemology actually depends on how do you falsify. So if you don't falsify, then obviously it becomes a dogma. Like, say, for example, there is so many dogmas in this country, like, say, the racist connotations of caste, the role of women in the society, especially, you think that we are in 21st century. Now, the debate is not about looking at women as household chores. Okay, we have come beyond that mature debate, but this is more of, a Victorian kind of a resurgence, which in India women are being looked at. And when I say Victorian, there is a very specific tilt to it. And Victorian in the sense that, like you have to be a very well educated woman, and also, you need to be well polished, know the arts of many things, like to music, to dance, to serve your guests with a very decent, civilized smile. But your dress and your public appearances have to be very much curtailed in terms of the demands of nationalism. This is what 19th century women faced actually in India, especially from the women of the feudal classes, even the princes. And there has been a lot of works which I'll not refer to, but there is a resurgence today where the women's dress has become a great narrative, at least the last 6 to 8 years, where the way in which, what is the red line between decent and indecent dressing, even to the extent of, a minister of culture of this government in the last term saying that, rapes happen because, like women wear provocative dresses. Now, this is dogma for you. Now, let's get back to communicative action. So the very idea of, like this whole neo-Aristotelian discourse where, Aristotle actually imagined this city-state where, decisions are arrived at through what Habermas later on called communicative action, where, like citizens deliberate upon this. So in a simple sense, there was a kind of deliberative democracy. Now, of course, in a small city-state, a deliberative democracy is possible. And from there, Hobbes actually imagined the neo-Aristotelian notion of the deliberative democracy, of course, in a very instrumental sense, not in an organic sense as what Aristotle was imagining. But what Hobbes was doing is bringing this whole idea of civil science, where there is a contract, and I'll not get into it, and the civil science where, rational individuals, like because of fear leading to social contract, and then the authority being established in the Leviathan. And there, a democracy would function according to the principles of right to life, where nobody would hurt your right to life. I'll not get into the details of the subsequent theorizing, where right to liberty was emphasized by somebody like John Locke and J.S. Mill, and then, contemporary modern liberal thinkers like Isaiah of Berlin and others. Now the question is, what Hobbes actually was doing in terms of civil science had a major impact on Carl Schmitt, the 20th century German philosopher. So now, again, because of the paucity of time, I cannot establish in detail the philosophical linkages between Hobbes and Carl Schmitt. But Carl Schmitt, redefined the notion of the Leviathan in terms of the exemplary, or what you can say, vast powers which Hobbes was trying to, bestow upon the Leviathan. But the difference was, here the Schmittian Leviathan was, like having vast executive powers where violence also could be justified. Then the right to life, was it getting negated? Now, whether right to life was getting negated, that becomes a significant question in Schmittian sense. So what do we mean by sovereign exceptionalism? So there is always an emergency situation which the sovereign has to deal. Now, what is that emergency situation? It may be a war, it may be a civil strife or something like that. So you cannot wait for a fascist kind of, or a parliamentary notion of a solution where you keep on deliberating and then make laws. You suddenly bring ordinances, and of course, presently, because of the good majority, huge majority rather, in this government in India, Parliament is also functioning almost like an executive. Now, like say for example, the abrogation of Article 370, which had given special status to the Indian territory of Jammu and Kashmir. Now that has been converted into Union territory with one stroke of the amendment. And that happened because the government had a majority. And then when I talk about deliberations, the larger public was, at least the stakeholders in Kashmir, was not taken into consideration. Government had the right, it is very much constitutional. There is nothing invalid in terms of constitution, but the only problem is the larger public was not taken into consideration. The communicative action or the deliberative democracy was not actually maintained. Now, say for example, deliberating with opposition parties, bringing an all-party meeting, reaching the Kashmiris. So that would have been, that's what a mature democracy actually tries to do. It's not the case that governments in India did not have majorities. Nehru enjoyed a lot of majority. Rajiv Gandhi, 405 out of 540 odd seats. That means a huge majority, but still Nehru and Rajiv Gandhi actually respected the verdict of the opposition. Now, the biggest problem which in India, leave apart the, what you can say, larger public, the opinion of the opposition party is not being considered. The irony is, normally opposition parties are known to create these narrative that, okay, government is doing all sorts of excesses. If some problem happens, will the government ask the opposition, go and ask the opposition leaders, why are you asking us? Now, this is what today's Indian democracy has come to. Why should the opposition be answerable? Opposition is there to raise questions, and if the opposition raises question, the irony of this country has been that government says, if the opposition is raising question, go and ask them. We are not raising this question. This is where the travesty, democracy has been transformed into a travesty through the Schmitt's notion of what we call as exceptionalism. exceptionalism in the state of exceptionalism. And what is the state of exceptionalism? Suddenly, what is that emergency that India has been confronting, that, you know, government has to do all sorts of things, Article 370, NRC, CAA, all this, all my learned colleagues here must have read in the newspapers and, you know, web platforms. Okay, you can bring all those laws. Now, don't question the people who question you. That means you don't want to listen to any critique. Then what does it mean? Then how should a democracy function? Presently, the biggest crime in this country has been that we should not question the government. Now, by saying this, it is not the government which is saying, ironically. Government has a huge machine of Facebook, WhatsApp, Twitter, Instagram, and all that. And government is happy enough to, you know, sit and enjoy the trolling happening between the people asking question and people who don't want people to ask the question. Now, this is, our democracy is now not actually fought in the parliament. Our democracy is not held up by the parliament or judiciary or media, but it is actually everybody in this country who just has a mobile phone or a laptop or an iPad and has a Wi-Fi or a data connection, and the whole world is yours. Now, I will not get into the autonomy, that's of an individual. There is a transformed nature of this whole, what we call as, every individual thinks that he's a fighter, he or she is a fighter. This is like cyborg kind of a mentality. You become like a huge, what you can say, fighter, and you can fight everything just sitting on, like, if Pakistan says something, you can vent out all, you know, like language is also getting unparliamentary. Now, why I have to discuss all this? Because the whole values of deliberative, I'm not saying that procedural democracy is functioning very well in this country. We are having very free and fair elections. Everything is happening. Bengal recently had elections, very free and fair, and government has taken all the troubles to ensure violence-free elections. That is quite commendable, even at the very grassroots level. But what is happening is the substantive democracy. Now, my question is about the substantive democracy. How can we actually ensure substantive democracy if you are not allowed to speak? And the only answer is Carl Schmitt's exceptionalism, where nationalism is more important. Then you are either branded as urban Naxal or you are branded as pro-Pakistan. So you can't even question if why the government has did this. Of course, on questions of national security, nobody is asking questions to government, because questions of national security is prime. Otherwise, our existence comes into question. But when you say there is lack of vaccine, or when you say there is lack of medicine, then people will come back to and say that, okay, you want to go to Pakistan, so you go. You will get better services. Now, this is not the way to conduct a public discourse. Now, because government has made a subtle narrative that there is something which is threatening this country. What is that fear? That abstract unknown fear? Is it the 20 crore, nearly 20 crore Muslims of this country? That is one fear. Or is it the left-wing insurgency, which is happening almost in 1 lakh square kilometer amidst in the heart of the jungles of this country? Or is it every citizen, normal citizen, anybody from any class, any profession, who wants to question the government? Now, it's very easy to create narratives. It says like what, you know, what happened to America after 9/11, suspecting everyone. So Now you have to appear, you have to demonstrate your loyalty to this country. Like, like there should be an apparent symbolism that where you demonstrate your loyalty to this country. Again, going back to what happened with Germany in the 1930s and 40s, where Carl Schmitt was defending in terms of a very kind of a theological notion where there is an exceptionalism where executive can take up all the powers at hand. In that sense, when you take up all that, is the executive almost claiming some sort of divine legitimacy where you don't, of course, the parliament, there is a semblance of parliamentary democracy. That is the biggest achievement. There is a facade of parliamentary democracy because the laws are passed, but there is an abuse of the majority. That is a problem. And it's very easy to say that opposition is not functioning out. But are you really listening to the opposition? And how did this public opinion get built up? Now there lies the problem. Leave apart the opposition, leave apart the government. People have the power to vote, and also it is not just, our duty is not just to vote, but people also need to engage in democracy. Now, are we really losing faith on democracy? Do we really want a one-man run, what to say? Like, people are also talking about presidential form of government where all authorities are more penetrative in the hands of the president, like the US. So in that sense, if you see, the subversion of the parliamentary, this whole substantive part of parliamentary democracy becomes a critical thing. Now, as I said, Karl Popper said anything which can be falsified is the actual truth. And of course, in terms of, historicism was a like basic issue for Karl Popper. We have come back to historicism. We are told there is one particular history which we need to understand, and we have to adhere to that particular kind of history, and we need to understand who actually troubled us. So obviously, the 20 crore Muslims of this country becomes a trouble. So it's very easy to construct what Karl Popper says, the differences between the friend and enemy, the political, the concept of political, which Carl Schmitt was saying, which has returned to us in a very big way, at least in this country, where that friend and enemy actually coexist, but the enemy is always a potential danger to be watched and to be put under surveillance. So the narrative is, we know who is the enemy. We only have to guard against that. So festivals, gatherings of others get unnoticed, gatherings of the Muslims get noticed, and they become super spreaders or corona jihadis. So it is very easy to construct this narrative, which has been done for the last 2 years. Recently, there was a huge Kumbh Mela in Haridwar, a Hindu, what you can say, congregation of the saints, and lakhs of people went. There must have been many corona cases, but nobody actually called them as Hindu saint jihadis or like terrorists or something like that. Because who is the enemy. Because Carl Schmitt's notion of the friend and enemy has already taught you to consider the potential danger. Who can? And every action is very easily comprehensible to us by saying that, okay, he or she is our enemy. And there is a stereotyping and there is an essentialist portrayal of that enemy also. So the problem is our post-truth society which we are living in. So we have WhatsApp universities, Facebook universities, everybody is constructing their own truth and just leaving it for the consumption of everybody in the public domain. So a simple WhatsApp message which doesn't need confirmation, or it doesn't need to be falsified or proven, like what Emmer Lakatos says, through some method. You don't need to do that. You just send a message in WhatsApp, then somebody will be a beef eater, obviously, and then there will be a mob lynching, because you know who is the enemy. The friend and enemy distinction is very, very clear. So obviously, when you know who is your enemy, then it will not be difficult for you for constructing these ideas that who can break the culture of this country by eating the beef. It is not just Muslims who do. Many other people in this country also eat beef, but there is a construction of the linkage between food habits of the Muslims, specifically to the Muslims, the beef eating, and then the narrative gets constructed. Because you all know, again, who is the enemy. So in that sense, when there is a post-truth society, even Carl Schmitt may not have imagined that, like something like in India, the post-colonial citizenship, which is the biggest debate, that, would become so contentious. India's public sphere is a contested public sphere where, or a contested public space where the post-colonial citizenship has never been debated. It was not even debated in India even after 1947. Of course, it was debated in Pakistan. That was the biggest debate, and Pakistan is still living with that debate, the nature of post-colonial citizenship. But suddenly in India, post-colonial citizenship has assumed enormous significance after 2014. Who should be the citizen of this country? So Muslims are always seen as potential secessionists because they took away Pakistan. So they all must go to Pakistan. So it's very easy to say that, okay, if you don't like, you go to Pakistan. If somebody takes a pro-Muslim position, somebody will call you and say that, okay, we will take a one-way ticket to Islamabad. We will send you one-way ticket to Islamabad, don't come back. And this has happened to many people, late Girish Karnad, and others who were liberal and more secular in their approach. So they actually faced somebody like Anant Murthy from South India, a literary figure. So they all got those threats that, okay, we will get a return ticket, one-way ticket to Islamabad. That means there is a space that is already created, and that goes at the heart of the post-colonial citizenship. So, of course, it was there. And when the Babri Mosque was actually demolished, so it was already clearly stated that, you should go back to Pakistan if you don't want to live with a secular space. Now, the definition of secular becomes something which is associated to Indian culture, and Indian culture becomes Hindu culture. Now, this construction of the semantic and semiotic construction of or projections of this Indian culture, which is secular, and to what extent? To the extent that whatever we decide, that has to be your restricted space. If you try to transcend that, what we call as Lakshman Rekha, then obviously you would be questioned that you are not secular. So being secular in this country is to, it's not the question that religions are not allowed to stay in this country. They are very much there. But the question is, as what Gayatri Spivak says, can the subaltern speak? Do they really have the agency to speak? And this is where, for me, the secular public culture, which was constructed for hundreds of years in this country, and based on those ideals, we actually got our emancipation from colonial yoke and the early years of this country, everything has been actually turned down, so much so that history also needs to be changed, and national archives of this country is also in danger. So that is the latest Vista project bulldozer. So with this, I thank you all for listening to me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Sanjeev Kumar. Thank you for your thoughts. Thank you for our introduction to Indian situation. And now, the last but not least, Professor Andriy from Department of Politics, Catholic University of America. And the title of his presentation is Nationalist Polarization and Weak Institutional Norms, Democratic Ceiling in South Korea. Professor.
Hey, hi. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak at this conference. It's my first time, I think, addressing colleagues based out of Ukraine. I'm actually in Manila, Philippines, even though my affiliation is with a Catholic university. So I feel like we really are a diverse global group. I just want to say that this paper, my remarks are based on a paper that I'm working on that's part of a project about democratic ceilings that's run by Gerardo Monk. He's a professor at University of Southern California, and Aram Her at the University of Missouri. And so I've co-authored a paper on nationalist polarization and democratic ceilings with my colleague Aram Her. And the paper looks at South Korea and Taiwan, but I'm going to focus mostly on South Korea since that's what I was asked to do. And then I'm also more familiar with the South Korean case. And I'm sharing my screen, so I hope everyone can see that. A thumbs up if you can see the shared screen. Okay, hopefully everyone can see the screen share because I have a few slides. There might be a question of why, this is a problem about democratic challenges to democracy and political order. So why focus on some of the most successful East Asian countries? These are the success stories of the third wave, South Korea and Taiwan. Of course, a few years ago, there's a lot of international media coverage about South Korea because of the impeachment process, the candlelight protest that led to the eventual election of the current president, Moon Jae-in. And so South Korea especially has been hailed as a democratic success. And so again, there may be some questions about why focus on these two countries and not other countries that have more pressing or challenging problems on the democratic front. And I do want to say though that even though South Korea is a consolidated democracy, it's definitely a consolidated democracy. I'm not disputing that, but some people are surprised when I show these Freedom House scores. I actually have the 2021, this is 2019. And I know there's people have debates about problems about measuring quality of democracy, but I just wanted to make this point that even though South Korea is considered a high quality democracy, if you look at its rankings, 83, it's not that bad, but look at some of the other countries that are around South Korea. So above it, you see Croatia, Mongolia, Panama. It ranks with Ghana. So some find that surprising that South Korea, even though you think of it as a developed country, a democracy, a consolidated democracy, that it's in the company of some of these other places. And so it does give pause, or at least some motivation for extra scrutiny about this country. And so with this project, we wanted to take a closer look with what we see as consolidated democracies, but with illiberal norms. And so what we find in places like South Korea or Taiwan, on the surface, it seems like a very strong democracy. They have regular elections. There's contestation for power. The turnover of leaders and parties, they're peaceful. So on the surface, everything looks fine. But if you dig a little bit deeper, we do find these cycles of inter-party retribution where politicians on different sides of the political spectrum really try to target one another. We see abuses of the executive power. There's a weak checks and balance system. And we do find that there are issues with press freedom. They do try to suppress the opposition from really criticizing the ruling party. And they don't do this through illegal means. A lot of times these are through legal measures, but they stretch or bend the law. They use lawfare, we call it, to try to weaponize, I guess, the existing institutions and rules to go after their political opponents. And so our paper, we try to explain why these illiberal norms continue to persist in otherwise stable democracy. So just because we mention challenges to democracy, it doesn't mean that consolidated democracies are free from their own problems. And as our first speaker mentioned, look at Denmark, we never know what the future may hold, or even countries like the United States. 20 years ago, no one would have thought we'd be debating about the downfall of democracy in the United States. In the same way, I think it's worth having this additional scrutiny towards even about the challenges of democracy and even some of the cases that we deem as most successful. Now, the argument that we make here, and it's coincidence that I'm following Dr. Kumar's presentation where he talked a lot about nationalism, but in our paper, we also look at nationalism, or this concept that we call nationalist polarization. And our explanation for why we see these illiberal norms persisting in places like Korea and Taiwan is because of this polarization or nationalist division that existed within these countries, but then rather than being resolved through democratization, they were actually further ingrained through the democratization process. So we explain nationalist polarization as a particular form of party polarization where the axis of division centers on mutually exclusive nationalist visions. So polarization, or the ideological distance between parties, has always had an uneasy relationship with democracy. On the one hand, some degree of polarization is actually a sign of a healthy democracy. There's democratic competition and it offers voters some real choices. But on the other hand, extreme polarization or too much polarization can quickly turn pernicious. It can reduce the room for political compromise. It eliminates informal guardrails of democracy. So things like forbearance, mutual tolerance, these things just fall to the wayside when there's intense polarization. So in this view, national polarization is especially detrimental to democratic quality. Now, I've already defined nationalist polarization, but I could say that the differences between just political polarization or ideological polarization versus nationalist polarization is that in the latter, with nationalist polarization, it's really about who we are as a nation or where we ought to go. So again, these differences are really about the future direction of the country and who we are as a nation. And parties can be polarized, of course, on a variety of ideological axes. But what sets nationalist polarization apart is the nationalist claims in distinction to other kinds of identity or policy claims. And we argue that nationalist polarization is inherently state-seeking, meaning that the nation is a political community. It deserves its own territory and self-rule, but beyond that, that there's a unified purpose. And what happens is that nationalist polarization reframes democratic competition as an all or nothing contest, that as political leaders, you want state capture. That means that you want to win in totality. There isn't really a sense of compromise. And nationalist polarization, it incentivizes two kinds of illiberal behaviors. First, it incentivizes political leaders to see the political opposition as an existential threat to my nationalist vision, and justifies and even encourages efforts to try to eliminate the political opposition. That's the exact opposite kind of behavior that we would expect in a healthy democracy. We would expect mutual tolerance. The second, mechanism of how nationalist polarization undermines democracy or creates this democratic ceiling is that it prioritizes the party's nationalist agenda over democratic principles. So you're willing to do whatever it takes to push forward your own national agenda, even if it means throwing out democratic principles out the window. So things like forbearance, mutual tolerance, compromise, these things are ignored, and you're willing to pursue your own agenda at the cost of violating core democratic principles. So we try to test this at both the elite level and the mass level, this idea that nationalist polarization is preventing democracies from really moving to the next tier. It's creating these problems underneath in societies like Korea and Taiwan. And I'll just talk about the Korea case and just what some of these examples are. So I skipped through this slide, but so I just said at the elite and national level, we're going to try to look at the effects of nationalist polarization. On this slide, we try to talk about the authoritarian period pre-democracy and how countries were polarized. There was, of course, the authoritarian rulers, but then there was also the democracy movement, the opposition movement. In South Korea, it was referred to as Minjung, which means movement or people-centered. The people movement, they were very progressive, but they also unified with forces that were much more, I guess, accommodating to the views of North Korea as well, which was a communist, a socialist country. So you have these elements that merged that were pro-democracy, but also pro-North Korea. And so that could be the opposition, and they were fighting against the authoritarian regime, whose narrative in terms of a nationalist agenda was really about development and anti-communism. So you had these two contending forces, and then during the democratization period in the middle, you see these sides forming within legitimate political means. So you see the development of political parties. I mean, political parties had existed even in the authoritarian period, but they didn't really mean much because the elections were rigged. But what we're arguing is that rather than kind of resolve these tensions or differences, democratization actually entrenched some of these divisions that were sown in the pre-democracy, in the authoritarian period. And so I want to talk a little bit more about this post-consolidation period. So I'm fast forwarding to the last 10 years or so of South Korean democracy. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about the previous conservative government. So one thing about South Korean democracy is that every 10 years you've had, since democratization in 1987, you've seen a change in government, a change between the opposition and the ruling government. That's actually a positive sign. That's a sign of a healthy democracy, that you can go back and forth roughly every 10 years or so. So it's not just one party rule. It's not like Japan where you've had basically one party rule for almost 60, 70 years with a few years of exception. But despite that, I wanted to highlight what has been going on in the last 10 years. And so I mentioned in this conservative period, so this was during the government of President Lee Myung-bak, so President Lee, and then President Park Geun-hye, so President Park. And so in terms of examples of some of these signs of illiberalism within otherwise consolidated democracies, I'd say at the outset, when President Lee was elected, he had a very distinctly conservative nationalist agenda. He vowed to jumpstart the economy through pro-capitalist deregularization. He wanted to improve ties with the United States. I think the most, telling agenda is that the conservatives and President Lee, they wanted to upend what was known as the sunshine engagement policy with North Korea that had been the progressive hallmark for the preceding decades. So before this turn to the conservative government, I mentioned there was about 10 years of progressive rule, and under Kim Dae-jung and his successor, Roh Moo-hyun, they were trying very hard to engage North Korea in what was seen as unconditional engagement towards North Korea, because they had this streak of being, I don't know if pro-North Korea is the right term, but they certainly wanted to engage North Korea and improve the relationship. in a way that's different from how conservatives approach North Korea. So at the outset, you have this conservative nationalist agenda. Our focus, of course, is on the illiberal means by which the Lee and the later Park administrations pursued such nationalist goals by silencing critics and castigating the opposition in their efforts to promote their nationalist agenda. So one of the first things that the Lee administration did by executive order is launch investigations against public officials who served under the previous Roh government. So the Prime Minister's office established an internal office of public service and ethics to audit and discipline public officials based on specific guidelines created by the Lee government. Now, the creation of an ethics office is entirely legal, and in principle, it's pro-democratic, especially if there was illegal things that were being done by the previous government. But many argue that the process of investigations violated democratic norms by granting investigative powers to conservative allies. And I think the most high-profile investigation was against former President Roh himself and his family members for corruption and bribery. There is sufficient evidence of bribery warranted in an investigation, but the intense pressure and the, you might call it a rigged system, took its toll. And President Roh actually committed suicide. And there's a sad joke about South Korean politics that almost every sitting South Korean president since democracy has gone to jail or is in jail. Actually, the previous two presidents are both in jail right now because they've been investigated by the current government. And so this is just an example of what I'm saying, this intense pressure against the opposition. So that you try to eliminate political opponents. The conservative Lee government and later the Park government also tried to silence civil society and anyone who criticized their party's nationalist agenda. And I'll just give one example. And it's this creation of a cultural blacklist where there was 342 organizations and 8,931 names of artists, poets, authors, filmmakers, and actors who had criticized the president and whose work were seen as overly sympathetic to North Korea. And these blacklisted figures were excluded from state funding, and they faced state-directed employment discrimination. There was actually notes and memos that had gone out saying not to hire these actors or not to hire these directors. And some of you may be familiar with the Oscar-winning film Parasite from last year, the South Korean movie, and the director, Bong Joon-ho, he was on this blacklist. And so he had talked about, for almost a decade, it was very difficult for him to even make any movies because he was seen as too politically left. And so again, there is this cultural blacklist, and it's not something that you would expect from a consolidated democracy. Later, the Park government also weaponized the national security law to suppress progressive views sympathetic to North Korea. So there's a far left party known as the United Progressive Party that had existed, but the Park government actually moved to ban this political party, saying that they were subversive, that they were actually had too close of a ties to North Korea. And so she's basically used her political power to try to eliminate other opposition parties. Now that's the conservative government. Now President Park was impeached, and then you had special elections, and you see the rise of a liberal president, a progressive president. That's the current Moon Jae-in government. And so when he comes to power, he felt he had a mandate because he was voted, he was elected, he was backed by these candlelight protests. You can call it people power. So there was this mandate for a new kind of fresh government after the ouster of the conservative Park government. And in a near mirror image to President Lee's ethics office, President Moon created 39 special committees staffed by members of progressive civil society to run what he called independent investigations on bureaucrats. And observers noted the thinly veiled partisan nationalist agenda behind such investigations. For example, the government prosecutors investigated 17 officials including low-level staffers within the Ministry of Education, for publishing a textbook that supposedly highlighted the positive achievements of the conservative dictatorship under Park Chung-hee. Now, Park Chung-hee was the father of the previous president who was impeached, Park Geun-hye. And they also claimed that this new textbook had downplayed the human rights atrocities committed by the authoritarian government. And there are also special investigations launched against the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to look at the management of the Park government's agreement between South Korea and Japan, and also the closing of industrial complex that was a North Korea South Korea joint venture that the progressives had promoted, and it was shut down, and the liberal government wanted to investigate this. And again, these are just examples where the government, so in this case, the progressive government, is trying to launch targeted investigations against the opposition. There's also examples where they've tried to quiet down, clamp down on certain groups of people who are critical to their North Korea policy. So there was a case where several North Korean human rights organizations have been defunded or investigated or have been barred from speaking in public because the current progressive government felt that it might derail its engagement process with North Korea. So what we find just from the South Korea case is that when nationalist polarization sets in, it throws out things like forbearance, these norms of democracy that are important for the long-term health of democratic nations, and we're seeing these being undermined because of this wave of national. I don't think wave is the proper term. I think it's always been there, but it's been intensifying, this idea of nationalist polarization. And if I were to open it up beyond South Korea, I'd say that nationalist polarization is a cause for illiberal democracies to open a new avenue. I do think there's some potential for research here that but it's opening new avenues for understanding questions of democratic regress in countries such as the United States, Great Britain, or Hungary, countries that were seen as consolidated democracies, but have now analysts are now pointing to problems based on things like the rise of ethnic nationalism or populist nationalist movements. So such variants of nationalism, like any kind of exclusive group identity, carries potentially illiberal elements. But those values alone don't undermine democracies. As we illustrated in the South Korean context, it's when political parties become polarized on competing nationalist visions that nationalism becomes weaponized against the internal other. This in turn breaks down the norms of mutual tolerance and forbearance that undergird healthy democracies. So I think I'll stop there, and I'm a little bit early, but maybe that will leave more time for our discussion. Thank you.
Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to switch on my microphone. Thank you very much, Professor Yeo. Thank you for your comprehensive analysis of South Korea situation, and our congratulations again. And now we have a time for discussions and questions. And I want to say that we have 8 questions now in our chat, and so I think we must start from these questions, and I will read it in the first question was from Zaim Khatak, and this is a question for all presenters and speakers. Khair Satak wrote, I want to know about my challenges faced. Sorry. I want to know now about main challenges faced to democracy in third world country. Svitlana wrote in the second section, we will be two presentations which deal with this topic, but I think we can start from discussion about these questions about main challenges to democracy in third world countries, because partly our presentations describe these questions. And maybe who will be first about maybe Professor Kutuyev, because of Ukraine.
Yeah, because of the country of origin. Thank you. By the way, again, this language of developed versus developing is being actively used and abused by different nations. For example, China, as you may know, in the World Trade Organization is defined as developing nation, and it gives China some preferences as far as its fees for global environmental protection is concerned. And China is fighting viciously and vigorously not to be kind of promoted, upgraded to developed nations, because it will automatically entail the rise of payments to these international organizations, kind of to fulfill international obligations in terms of environmental protection and so on and so forth. And Ukraine is defined as a developing nation by this association agreement with the European Union. So apart from kind of democracy itself and kind of internal political, cultural and institutional challenges to democracy itself, I think that developing countries, which are peripheral countries and sometimes semi-peripheral countries, if we are to employ world systems theory language, they have a set of social and economic issues. They are more often than not underdeveloped, are not heavily industrialized, or they're on this downward spiral of deindustrialization. If we are talking about post-Soviet countries, majority of them, they got incredible corruption. They got the incredible social inequality. They got oligarchic economic systems, polarized social structure, and therefore I think these are the major challenges and major threats to developing, embedding, introducing, kind of, you name the process, functioning democratic institutions and practices in such societies. Because again, quite often democracy is considered as some sort of scam. I think there was early 20th century American anarchists who once remarked that if elections decided anything, they would prohibit them. Establishment, they would outlaw them. So quite a few people, and I began my talk by quoting Vladimir Lenin. Thought that liberal democracy is the best possible nutshell for capitalist society, for capitalist economy, because on the one hand, people have a choice, but it's a choice of figureheads, of people who are in kind of purely legal terms are at the helm of the political system, of the society, at the commanding height. But in reality, these people have very limited influence on restructuring economic and social relations. And I think we've been witnessing this with the incumbent administration in Ukraine, President Zelensky, Ukraine, when he is employing such institution as National Security and Defense Council to impose sanctions on Ukrainian citizens. And well, majority of these people who have been sanctioned by Ukrainian National Security Council, they don't seem to be kind of paragons of democracy, human rights, and economic transparency. But at the same time, that the fact that this administration has to turn to this branch of executive while ignoring the rest of state apparatus and judicial apparatus, I think attests to the fact that Ukrainian state is kind of incapable of enforcing kind of general set of rules. So we have kind of getting back to the question. So we have a set of mammoth issues: economic, social, cultural, and a weak, ostensibly democratic state to deal with these issues. And there is this great disconnect between kind of goals, between slogans, between ideals like we are democracy, we are promoting democracy. Democracy is the government by the people, for the people, and what else? Well, for the whatever, by the people and for the people. But in fact, we've got vested interests who have been remarkably stable and remarkably safe. At least in Ukraine, at least as far as Ukraine is concerned. And I think that Michael Mann's distinction between infrastructural and despotic power is extremely useful in this respect. Infrastructural power is epitomized by the European Union states when it's when there is a rule of law, kind of the rule is relatively liberal, soft, but yet at the same time there are these general rules which are effectively imposed by European states. And in post-Soviet countries, well, not just post-Soviet countries, in developing world, you have so-called strongmen. But these strong men are at the helm of weak institutions, and the states usually have enough resources to get rid of their individual opponents. Like I think the example which immediately pops up is that clash between President Kuchma and his Prime Minister Pavlo Lazarenko. Kuchma managed to get off individual oligarch, individual crook, Lazarenko in that case, but he did not manage to root out oligarchic system. So I think this is kind of this wraps up the whole issue that we've got weak states, which are ostensibly democracies, dealing with mammoth challenges and issues rooted in social and economic spheres.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Kutuyev. I see Andrew Yeo raise his hand, please. And Professor Yeo.
Yes, thank you. I'll try to be brief on this question about challenges to democracy in the developing world. And I just wanted to share, just from my experience being in Manila for the last year, and seeing how this government is addressing COVID-19, what some of the challenges are related to democracy and governance. The Philippines is a lower middle income country. I don't know if that qualifies as a third world, but one of the things I wanted to point out is the problem. One of the biggest problems I see is patronage, clientelism, and corruption. The government doesn't follow. I mean, on the surface, there are these democratic rules and procedures, but they don't really follow them. When they need to get things done, especially in this COVID climate, where you need to move quickly, you start just choosing people, picking people that you know, you point them on task force, you skirt around any kind of procedures. And on one hand, you can understand because you want to go to people that you trust. So Duterte only trusts a certain number of people. Most of them are from his hometown in Davao. But what that means is that governance is lacking. It means that the performance is very poor. The way this government has handled COVID-19 has been terrible. And I think it goes back to some of these problems with in the democracy in the developing world. It's because you're relying too much on patronage and clientelism, and then there's just a lot of corruption. Now, corruption is everywhere, even in developing countries. Look at even like the United States. But here, the difference is, if you ask even ordinary people, they may not see it as corruption. They see it as that's just the way of doing things. That's how things get done. I talk to my brother. I ask this friend who I know, and yes, they're going to pocket a lot of money or they might get benefits, but they don't really see it as being illegal or corrupt. Now, if there's an opponent that later wants to go after them, they'll say, oh, you broke the law, now you're going to go to the jail. That's what also happens in an undemocratic society. And Duterte has been very good at, if he doesn't like people or if he thinks they're getting in his way, he's going to like charge them with some kind of, crime. But I think the view of corruption and things like patronage in the developing world and the third world is very different from some of the advanced industrial democracies. But the problem is they don't see it necessarily as a problem. So this continues to be perpetuated. It's very difficult to resolve. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Maybe next question. Next question is special question for Professor Lieven from Gunandi Andro from Indonesia. At the moment, the sharp development of information and technology seems to affect the quality of democracy, indicated by the use of fake news, hoax, etc., in the campaigns to destroy fair elections. Don't you think that the future enemy of democracy is an uncontrollable use of technology? Use of technology. Thank you, Professor.
Well, yes, it's obviously a very great problem. But when it comes to information technology, I've always seen the social media today as basically a speeded up technological version of the traditional bazaar, where information, often fake information, rumors are exchanged and passed on. There are two sides to this. One is the media themselves by which it's passed on. But the other is, of course, the education of the population and the polarization of the population, whereby people retreat into their silos in which they only talk to each other, and all their conspiracy theories, all their beliefs are confirmed in this echo chamber. Sorry, excuse me a second. Sorry. But I see for the future two other kinds of technology as even more dangerous. The first potentially is AI, artificial intelligence. Now, we don't know how great the effect this will be, or automation, but we can see already how automation has began by abolishing huge swathes of working class jobs and is now moving on to abolish huge swathes of middle class jobs. Whether it will create enough new jobs to compensate for that is wholly unclear. And if we're heading for a period of maybe not high unemployment, but very high, insecure, badly paid employment, well, we can already see from so many countries how this is a threat to liberal democracy. I mean, this has been an absolutely key factor in promoting the rise of the populist right. Of course, especially at a time of high immigration, if there are fewer good jobs for more people coming in. So I think that's a great potential issue. The other one, which is some more speculative and science fiction-like, but you can see the harbingers of it there already, is of course genetic engineering and the extension of life. I mean, if you see a situation which is entirely conceivable in future, in which rich people live to be 130 and the mass of the population dies at 75, it's hard to see how people can possibly see that or will see that as compatible with democracy. Yeah, I mean, I think those are the three technological issues that really threaten democracy in future.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor. And the next question from Stavroula Tsirogiani. I'm sorry for my pronunciation, but it's very hard for me. The question is not the notion category of the state itself problematic. He stressed that Gurminder Hambra suggests that we should start thinking in terms of empires, then nations, to deconstruct the histories of inequalities and concept of developments. Do you think that this is important, and what alternatives are there to start thinking about these tensions you are describing? So, as I understand that this is a question about tensions between national states and empires, and the question about is it democracy, is it empire more comfortable for democracy than national states? I understand the question in such way. Maybe, I don't know, maybe Professor Kumar, as I understand the situation is India about multinational, multicultural states more closely to this question.
Enter, mute, escape.
Should I respond?
Yeah.
Has left the meeting.
Okay, so apart from this, who has emailed me around 4 or 5 questions, so I'll try to address everything. So when we are looking at a more multinational and multicultural countries, democracies obviously can succeed. As I said, if I want to go back to my own philosophical position, where today when we are looking at more deterritorialization and reterritorialization, both the processes are happening in a very simultaneous. It's a very interesting phase of globalization. Of course, it's not a new phenomena. It has been happening since the 70s, 80s, but it's ongoing. That's why it becomes important, where multiculturalism and the need for affirmative action and liberal rights become significant, because on the one hand, you cannot escape globalization that we have already accepted. Of course, there have been tendencies where singular monovalent assertions of or what we can call as cultural monisms have been asserted, but that actually does not remain uncontested. So whenever there is monovalent assertions of culture or singular forms of culture done by an establishment with the help of the civil society also, and there is a certain degree or considerable degree of opposition also. We also had protests against NRC and CAA and other things. If somebody was talking about beef ban, the others were talking about more liberal food culture. We should not debate food culture because that's a significant cultural right. So there is a notion of cultural rights. So, but what happens is, when we deterritorialize, of course, it's a transnational phenomena, but in a country like India, which is huge, and in that sense, deterritorialization can happen also within the borders of the country. Like somebody coming from Bihar and settling in Delhi, and then he or she being questioned, you are not a Delhiite. So these tendencies are also there. So it's a simultaneous process of deterritorialization, where somebody from the eastern part of India coming to Delhi and experiencing homelessness or disembedded. But the disembedding mechanisms they try to negate by what we call as reterritorialization, where they create their own spaces. Like we have a Bengali colony like Chittaranjan Park in Delhi. But what happens is, when the majority starts ghettoizing it, like you are not the original Delhiite, then the contest in that multicultural space within the democratic structure gets intensified, because global cosmopolitanism and local vernacularizations tend to compete with each other. You know, the vernacular and the cosmopolitan are always in contest with each other. And of course, it happens in many ways, you know, like that can take a more violent turn also, majoritarianism or, you know, minoritarian radicalism. So that is one thing. And there was another question on Indonesia, like basically like caliphate. But of course, what I mean to say is the whole notion of caliphate, when I look at it, the idea itself becomes, you know, it's a catachresis in the sense when today people don't have that kind of a spiritual depth to actually invoke the idea of caliphate. It was the four rightly guided caliphs, the Sahabis, who actually had the notion of caliphate right on their fingertips, in the sense that they learned to live with Islam with the Prophet. So the caliphate was established in a particular circumstance, but once, you know, Muawiyah actually, you know, politicized the succession issue, and then Karbala happened, then whole, you know, like there was a territorial angle to the caliphate which comes in, and there was an imperial angle that comes in, and then there were many issues which, you know, like lack of time I cannot discuss. Like then the whole idea of fitna comes in when Ibn Taymiyyah actually, you know, calls for fitna, you know, in the name of actual Islam, and that is where his whole neo-Aristotelian logic of going back to the Hadith methodology comes in. So there is a huge backlog in terms of, you know, interpreting today's caliphate. Even ISIS wanted to create a caliphate, but that is completely a catachresis and a misplaced notion. So, and of course, religious notions come in that, and in India we have a notion of Hindu state, but that is not as structured as what, you know, we can call it as a Hindu state. As regards Pakistan, I agree with my friend. Pakistan is a very resilient country and its democracy is doing well, despite, as I said, there was a lot of debate on post-colonial citizenship, but at least since 2008, we have a good functioning democracy, and that's a good sign in that sense. And there were 3 questions on India which was posted to me. Is there anybody in the BJP who actually critiques Hindu nationalism? Even if they are there, but, you know, like presently looking at the authoritarian structure of Carl Schmitt kind of an executive, like nobody wants to risk their careers. And so that's where, like, that means leave apart critique from outside, there is no internal critique also. Now that is the problem with discourse ethics, or what we call as communicative action is completely scuffled. So that is a problem. There is no internal critique also. It's difficult, at least on top of my mind. I may be wrong, but on top of my mind, I don't remember anybody questioning the present wave of Hindutva or Hindu nationalism within the Sangha Parivar. That I have not seen. So maybe I may be wrong, but at least on top of my head, I'm not able to remember, because internal critique is also a difficult problem. It used to be there once upon a time. So like even when RSS was established, Hindu Mahasabha was established, they had internal debates. People did not agree so easily that whatever Hedgewar said, whatever Golwalkar said, people did not agree so easily. But that culture is gone now. It's not the problem with the founding fathers of these great intellectuals like Hedgewar and others. It's not their mistake. It's the way in which, as I said, dessert is being served with more salt or more sugar. Nehru Gandhian values, people being misguided, all obviously, you know, like that's what I said, media is playing its role to the hilt, in the sense that, you know, like, I don't know how the whole equations, TRP and other things work, but, you know, people are enjoying because there is a pent-up anguish or a pent-up anger against the other, and that the media has exploited too. And somewhere down the line, present whole dispensation, ideological as well as political, both being considered as a real bastion of nationalism, and this is our real nationalism, that somewhere conclusively much of the Hindu majority has accepted it. Well, vote bank politics, it has always been obvious. So it is there. Why do you invoke ideologies? It's for vote bank politics. That's very much obvious. Thank you.
Thank you. Please answer very briefly because we have no time for. But well, because questions. Now we have 10 questions, not 8, and the special questions to Anatol, Lieven, Pavlo Kutuyev from Mikhail Minakov. Are there any instruments in the liberal democracy to decrease polarization and overcome the fundamental threats to it? Is the polarization of fundamental issue a doom for liberal democracies?
Well, yes, it is a fundamental issue. I mean, what to do about it is very difficult because it's fundamental. The disagreements are fundamental. In an ideal world, you try to approach things from as objective as an angle as possible, and try to at least diminish the socioeconomic pressures which drive greater anger. And I think that the Biden administration in America is trying to do that. It's trying to diminish at least the socioeconomic suffering of the white working classes so as to reduce their polarization. But it seems that the basic ideology of the Democratic Party and also its calculations for the future mean that, for example, the Biden administration cannot change immigration policy, which is a fundamental driver of right-wing populism. And of course, when it comes to religious issues, abortion, gay marriage, if you actually believe in religion, in conservative religious principles, these are non-negotiable. And so there are limits to which genuine cultural ideological polarization can in fact be addressed.
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's couldn't have agreed more with Anatol that well, it's problematic because it's so problematic because it's so fundamental. And on the one hand, democracy kind of presupposes that there are different opinions and there are conflicts, and every opinion is openly discussed, and no one is protected from criticism. But the question is what happens and what are we supposed to do when this conflict becomes polarized, and these conflicts begin tearing the fabric of society and politics and civil society apart. So, I mean, speaking in a kind of Platonian fashion, one could argue that the idea of democracy will survive, while some real life democratic society will fail. But of course, it's not very hopeful for these real societies facing challenges to their real democracies. And as a representative of academic institution, which is university, I think kind of one of the possible solutions of this issue is to promote a dialogue and conflict resolution, not just among nations, but within democratic nations themselves, trying to give voice to different sides of the debate, while kind of maintaining the boundaries of decency and civility.
Okay, thank you. We have 3 special questions to Professor Sanjeev Kumar. Partly he answered of this question, as I understand, but I will read it, and please, Professor, answer very briefly because we have a lack of time. First two questions from Pranaya Deb. First question is, we Indians, the follower of Gandhi, are religious, we are tolerant and democratic. We love the sacrifice ourselves for the great cause prescribed by our leaders. But are not these valuable qualities coming to be as restrictions in the past to realize the hard trust? And aren't these innocent sentiments of simple Indian people being misused for political motives? And the second question is, are not the great religious values of India being misinterpreted for void bank policy? And special question to Professor Kumar from Andrew Yeo. The Bharataya Janata Party and Modi's increasing intolerance of other religious groups, such as Muslims, Christians, has been concerning. Are there any advocates within the ruling party that actually recognize Hindu nationalism as a problem for the health of India's longer-term democracy? Or is the Bharataya Janata Party digging in its heels, sowing further divisions? Thank you for your question. Please, Professor Kumar.
Currently unmuted, escape.
Thank you, Chair. I think I thought I had answered this, but still I'll give one-liners each. Simple-minded people, obviously, we are basically, like Gandhian values have really influenced us. But as I said, public culture has declined. And since we don't have much, space to debate, that obviously is that culture is obviously going. And regarding the second question, basically, advocates within the Bharatiya Janata Party who will critique Hindu nationalism. I think I answered this. For me, at least on top of my mind, I don't remember anyone who could do that in the present dispensation, at least. And the third question is basically on misinterpreting religion for vote bank politics. And that's obvious because religion doesn't tell you to, at least, the canonical sources of Hinduism, where we begin with the Vedic text, it's very, very clear. Vedas and Upanishads have been created only through a culture of, which had communicative action and discourse ethics. And that itself is completely stifled today. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for your brief question. And next question from, I'm sorry for my pronunciation, Hendragunawan from University Hasanuddin, Indonesia. It's a question for all speakers. Then we talk about democracy. The party of the spotlight always the government. However, there is also another kind of democracy, which is economic democracy, such as democracy of the workplace, and the existence of income inequality. These democracies tend to be ignored meanwhile in Asia and Eastern Europe. A very close relationship between government and businesses is prevalent. Could we put this issue in the agenda of democracy discussion? Yeah, I think we've put this question in our agenda, but maybe Pavel Kutuyev as a representative of Eastern Europe, or maybe another speakers who want to very short and very briefly ask.
So, go right ahead.
Sure, I'll just be very brief for Asia. I mean, I absolutely think that the close relationship between business and government has been a problem for democracy, especially with countries that rapidly develop. It's the developmental state. In South Korea and in Taiwan, the discourse was much more prevalent, I think in the 90s and the 2000s, about these large conglomerates that had close ties to the business. And the mechanism for where we see these democratic problems is that you see basically the rich getting richer and the poor, the have-nots having still nothing. And so it's creating a severe income inequality. So I think in the South Korean context, they have tried to address this through government, a lot of reforms for these large conglomerates. They're called chaebols in South Korea. So it has been very much a part of the discourse, but I think with these reforms, it's kind of gone away. And especially when you have a liberal government in power, they tend to be not as friendly to business. So we haven't seen that discourse as much, but in general, yes, I think the big business and their relationship to government has been a problem and a part of the conversations about democracy in many Asian countries.
Okay, what do you want to add some statements, Pavlo?
Yeah, very briefly. Okay, we've got kind of ultra liberal position embodied by political figures like Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, when government is a problem and not a solution, or part of the major part of the problem. Therefore, if we imply this logic, then market is the solution, business is the solution. But in post-Soviet countries, I think we can legitimately claim that both the government and well, this pseudo or quasi or underdeveloped market are major elements of the problem, because governments tend to be corrupt. They introduce lots of red tape regulations, and these regulations are either suffocating or aimed at extracting kickbacks, bribes from participants of market activities. While market activities often take place within the framework of black market, shadow economy in Ukraine, well, one of the most stable kind of statistical figures about Ukrainian economy is the volume of shadow economy. Since early 90s up until present, it's over 50%, from 50 to 60%. Incredible, incredible figure. And let's not forget about globalization and opportunities for capital, for big business to be mobile. So if we introduce strict restrictions, strict regulations, if you want to tax big businesses heavily, well, they can flee. Well, Ukraine, again, is on path of deindustrialization. So kind of most lucrative sectors of its economy are agricultural sector and extractive industries. So they are not, so these are not financial services. So this hampers mobility of its owners, but still these spheres have been kind of heavily monopolized, and a handful extremely rich individuals, if they're hard pressed, can simply leave that dilapidated industrial and agricultural infrastructure behind and move closer to their offshore accounts and bank accounts in cities like London and New York City. So it's a vicious circle, and frankly speaking, I don't know how to break it without turning a state, kind of post-Soviet state, in some sort of Hobbesian Leviathan, and without killing a hen laying gold eggs. So kind of very problematic question, very problematic issue. And again, it's kind of good we are addressing it, but we are far from solving it.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. We have no time, but we have two interesting questions else. And if you excuse me, I will ask these questions. As I understand, the one question special for Professor Anatol Lieven. It's a question from Carla Eva. My question is regarding to legitimacy. What determines legitimacy when we are in political system domain? Are elections the way to legitimacy? I am raising this question because, as we all know, most of the tyrannic political systems go on apparently with legitimacy, as most of them come after a legal election procedure. Professor Lieven, please, very shortly.
Well, elections do help with legitimacy, but of course elections can be rigged, and you also have, what's being called plebiscitary dictatorship, whereby precisely you have one vote which sort of confirms a government in power, and then it's allowed to get on with things. After that, it's a matter of performance. It's what the state concerned can achieve, and ultimately its legitimacy will stand or fall by that.
So, yeah, the question about legitimacy is very difficult, but very important. And last questions, important question too, as for me, is from Kim Jason Veleska. What can you say on the seemingly failure of the people power in fighting for democratic values? For example, Hong Kong, Myanmar, Arab Spring, Thailand, Belarus, etc., etc. So, but why, as I understand this question, why the people did not win this struggle for democracy in these countries? I mean, maybe Professor Lieven.
Well, first of all, you won't win if there is simply too much united, effective, repressive power on the other side. Secondly, as in Egypt, what I said about fundamental divisions about the nature of state, you won't win if you yourselves are deeply divided in what you actually want, what you're fighting for. But thirdly, of course, these movements have to be institutionalized in organized mass political parties and other organizations, like the socialist movements in the past. They were embedded in political parties, in trades unions, in a web of social organizations. The people power is simply a mass of people churning around. It can bring down a given government, but it can't in itself create anything. For that, as by the way Marx and Engels fully acknowledged, you need to have alternative institutions of power and influence in place. And in some countries, over time, people power has been able to create that. In other places, as in most of the Arab Middle East, it's failed totally. I mean, so much comes back in the end, I'm sorry to say, but to local culture and society. By the way, just a side note on oligarchy and links of business to government. There's a fascinating study by Edward Kang contrasting South Korea and the Philippines, and pointing out that in the Philippines, oligarchical control and link to government has been a terrible hindrance to development. In South Korea, it appeared to work magnificently. But these are two countries with very different societies and very different cultures.
Okay, thank you very much. I see that Professor Andrew Yeo write his answer that, and Professor more optimistic, for example, not so pessimist as me, and he thinks that democratic change does not come overnight, and fighting in the future for democracy will be. Thank you very much for all participants. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for your reactions. And now we have time for rest, and we will meet at 2 p.m. In Kiev time for the second part of our seminar, and we will discuss very interesting questions about the situation in Great Britain and European Union, about the situation in Georgia, in Ukraine, and in Malawi, and so on, so on. Please, we will see you later. Thank you.